decisions.
Jim Willey. Jim is, of course, the editor of the Hat Trick Letter. It can be found at goldenjackass.com. And he is a longtime friend of Turdville. We always enjoy speaking with him at this time of year for kind of a year in review and year look ahead. This has been such an eventful year, and 2019 promises to be eventful, would be one way to put it. So I thought, well, this should be very entertaining and a must listen for everybody. So anyway, Jim, thank you for spending some time with us. I think it's going to be great to visit with you.
Well, I hope so. I like to look back at history, recent history, not centuries, but decades and years. And I don't have a prepared speech here, Craig. I like to look back and see the cycles and see that we're not fixed. Mm-hmm. Because when you don't fix a crisis, what you're really doing is starting a clock for the next crisis. And the way you handle that crisis will determine whether the next one is even bigger. And what we've done since Lehman was killed, I do not like hearing or repeating or saying that Lehman had a failure. Lehman was murdered by Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, which bought billions of bonds, mortgage bonds, and never paid for them. And after that, Goldman Sachs forced the takeover, rather, of AIG so they can get 100 cents on the dollar, and everybody else would get 60 or 30 cents on the dollar for insured bonds. It was a crime scene. Okay, since the Lehman, let's just call it the Lehman event, the Lehman crisis. Since the Lehman, let's just call it the Lehman event, the Lehman crisis. Nothing has been fixed. Absolutely nothing.
Right.
All the different poor underwriting that took place was broadened to include all bonds, including government sovereign bonds. And in the process of doing this, they decided in their infinite recklessness, not wisdom, to force QE, which is, they call it quantitative easing. It's just a queer name. It means hypermonetary inflation for the benefit of the big banks and the government, which have lost their bondholders and investors. The bond demand went away. So facing a default by the U.S. government debt, they went into QE to cover the bonds and create fabricated demand, and then they brought in the interest rate swap derivatives to make it machinery in addition to simple just human effort. The result, Craig, is that we made the U.S. Treasury bond the subprime bond that we knew back in 2006 as the mortgage bond and Fannie Mae. The U.S. Treasury bond is now the global subprime bond. And some people might say, Jim, that's a stupid thing to say. And I challenge them. We've got over $1 trillion in annual deficits, which was my forecast in 2009. Every single year, over $1 trillion in deficits. Yep. We have an absence of buyers at the Treasury auctions. We have machinery producing demand for the bonds. We have foreign dumping of the bonds, which end up at the doorstep of the U.S. Treasury Department, which covers it all. We've got liquidation, this has been going on 5 years, at a 35% discount. And who is monitoring the quality of these bonds, as in debt rating? Nobody. They're all AAA by law, by Reich finance law. We've made the U.S. Treasury bond the subprime bond. We're setting it up for massive haircuts, for a restructure, which is a formal step toward a default. Okay. What I like to do, Craig, is to go through a number of events. I've got about 10 of them here.
All
right.
I
think I do have 10. How about if I just ring them off, and when I mention a key event, I'm going to mention the consequence.
Let's do it.
As the second, like an echo.
Well, let's do that, Jim. Like I said, this has been a year of consequences, no doubt about it. And as we wrap up the year, the metaphor everybody uses is the Fed withdrawing the punch bowl, and so therefore all the equity markets are collapsing. And I think it's pretty clear that the Fed is going to have to change at least the stated policy, the overt policy is going to have to change next year, and that's impacting everything. So clearly, 2019 is going to be crazy. But again, the value that I always see in these year-end podcasts that we do is not so much the what you see next year, but your distinct ability to go back and talk about the impact of things that happened this year that a lot of people overlook. So I know you've got a list of things that are on your mind that, again, a lot of these things are probably things that folks haven't thought about or maybe missed. So I think at this point, I'm just going to sit back and let you run with it. Tell us what you've seen in 18, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, each one of these events is a key major impact event, and they're ongoing. It's not like they have a stir, and they're not resolved, and they're getting worse and worse, and they're begging for a resolution or an explosion, one or the other. And if there's any lesson to be learned in the last 10 or 15 years, it is that the United States and the London handlers do not fix anything ever.
Yeah.
Ever. They patch it over, they rinse, they throw more money at it, and they do it all over again. And if there's a systemic risk, they widen the tentacles so that the entire system becomes at risk rather than a single point like in '08 with the mortgage bonds. Because what was true of mortgage bonds in '08 is now true of the Treasury bond in 18. It's like a 10-year cycle. Okay, here are the events. Number one, the U.S. government debt is in trouble. It is now true of the Treasury bond in 18. It's like a 10-year cycle. Okay, here are the events. Number one, the U.S. government debt is in trouble. Okay, we've got unspeakable deficits over $1 trillion. They're growing. The borrowing costs are huge, and there are reports that they exceed the entire tax revenue. In other words, the entire government is now a deficit operation. And the impression from foreigners is that it'll never be repaid, the debt. So Obama doubled the debt, Baby Bush doubled the debt, and this is the definition of Ponzi.
Yeah.
So where's this heading? It's heading toward a global rejection that has already begun. It's a global rejection called the de-dollarization movement. Global rejection called the de-dollarization movement, where nations are deciding we don't want to use the dollar, and they're dumping the treasury bonds, and China is doing something exceedingly clever of using treasury bonds as both foreign aid and like a front like to Angola. It's a front for the budget to keep them liquid in Angola, and all the treasury bonds come back to China in RMB terms. Okay, it's indirect exchange. Most of the Russia-China Holy Grail energy deal is done with treasury bonds. The pipeline from Russia to China was done and paid for with treasury bonds. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Nord Stream 2 to connect Germany and their second gas pipeline to Russia, I wouldn't be surprised if they use treasury bonds there too.
Yep.
Okay, so the impact is global rejection, government debt being in trouble, and the de-dollarization happening. The countries around the world are saying, you're screwing with the global currency reserve by printing money to cover your debt. You're screwing with the foundation to the banking system across the entire globe. This will not stand. Okay, that's point number one. I don't have any specific order, but I'll try to keep some semblance of importance with the order.
Okay.
Okay. Gold is the best performing asset in 2018. This is astonishing. Okay, you have the stock market down. You have the bond market down. Rising interest rates means bonds are losing value. You have many different asset classes in trouble. You have high-yield bonds in trouble. You have corporate bonds like General Electric in trouble. This is an alarming sequence of events that is leading to a crisis, and the crisis is translating into gold being a great asset to hold during the crisis. Okay. This is a great asset to hold during the crisis. Okay. This is alarming. I don't know how to describe this. We've had like 6 years where gold has been the suppressed asset, the asset in deep trouble, the asset that doesn't earn a yield supposedly, the asset that the press has been denigrating, that the government officials say, basically they're saying we're going to give you a really hard time if you try to own it. If you try to buy it, we're going to put paperwork in front of you. We're going to make obstacles. And now Canada has a ban for mailing gold coins. This is insane. So the public is reacting by buying gold, maybe not in the United States so much. I'm sorry to say, but I find the Americans to be pretty much going to get more attention, publicity, and really positive spin. You're going to get more and more fund managers say, we don't like the stocks, we don't like the bonds, we don't like corporate bonds, we certainly don't like high-yield bonds, and the emerging market bonds are the worst of all. What do you like then, sir? We like gold. You're going to get it more and more and more. And I find Alistair McLeod at Gold Money to be a great analyst, and he, if you can get your hands on some of his articles, they're always very well written, they're always rather comprehensive, and they cover a lot of different things.
Yes, good friend of TFMR,
Next
too.
point. Well, good. Okay, next. The U.S. military is in retreat. Now, you can make an argument, and I do, the U.S. military is in retreat. Now, you can make an argument, and I do, that they've got the second best military, and that's one reason they're in retreat. And there's a lot of very old, tired opinions that float around and just do not go away, that we've got full spectrum dominance and that we've got the best technology in the world and we have the world's best fighting men and the best trained people. We don't. We don't. Anyone who paid attention for the event that happened in, I think, 2014, the USS Donald Cook incident, anyone who paid attention to that, anyone who paid attention to something that happened about 7 or 8 years before that with a global demo, I don't think it was the Paris weapons show. I think it was something of near equal importance and exposure. But the Russians showed off their missile, their rival to the Tomahawk. It's called the Sunburn. And the Sunburn was shown to have much greater accuracy and much longer range than the very old Tomahawk missile. And then they improved upon, the Russians did, they improved upon the Sunburn missile with the Onyx, O-N-Y-X. That proved to be just a little leap better. And the U.S. military officials were aghast. Okay, so this is what the military officials are watching, but the press continues with their stupid analysis and impressions that are very, very obsolete.
Yeah.
Okay, the main zone that I point to is not U.S. is using some experimental micronuclear bombs.
Really?
To see what the damage is and to see if anybody notices and to see what kind of publicity spreads around the world in terms of, bad actor.
Huh.
The real focus I have, Craig, is on Syria.
Yeah.
Syria had the attention of all Europe, all Arab world, and Russia. China's watching, and the United States is a full participant with their proxy of ISIS, which is a Langley creation and a Langley operation with Saudi collusion. And we had to bug out. Okay, so with all this global attention from 5 major global entities paying attention, whereas maybe only 2 paid attention in Ukraine, in Syria, with more eyes on it, the U.S. had to back out. All this global attention from 5 major global entities paying attention, whereas maybe only 2 paid attention in Ukraine. In Syria, with more eyes on it, the U.S. had to back out. And Turkey is a player there also. They've got some designs. And there's another angle that wasn't there in Ukraine, and that is the Genie Oil Company. That's Genie. And its board members include Rothschild and Murdoch and Soros and a few other bigwig elites. So they decided that the big gas deposit called the Leviathan in the Mediterranean near the Israeli, Lebanon, and Syrian coast was just too big to share. And the land mass deposits for the Leviathan covered a large portion of Syria. So let's have a war in Syria. Let's, kill 100,000 civilians because they're not human anyway. This is the attitude of these elite globalists.
Yep.
And now the U.S. had to bug out. So, Craig, Syria is not working out for the U.S., the U.K., and the West.
Yeah.
It's just not working out. So the U.S. Actually had to succumb to the publicity and the successful exercises of the Su-400 Russian anti-missile system, which again eclipsed the U.S. version, which is the Patriot. The Patriot's 20 years old. It's not quite as old as the Tomahawk, but we've got old technology, and the only new technology that really is getting a lot of publicity for the United States is the F-35, which new technology that really is getting a lot of publicity for the United States is the F-35, which stinks. Yeah. The airplane, the fighter aircraft.
Right.
We're having to force our allies to buy it. We're bullying allies to buy it. Okay, so we're not the top anymore.
Yep.
We're not. Okay, that's a very big event that was not true the last couple of years.
All right, number 4.
Number 4. I call it the Saudi break. I noticed about 3 years ago that there are some very big events happening, and they related to the petrodollar, and it was a matter of the petrodollar falling apart, being dismantled. And it's big derivatives. It's derivatives that link together the dollar, the euro, the pound, and crude oil. The basis of the petrodollar foundation bonds, and not dump them. In other words, take payment in treasuries and not change the form of their payment or their savings in the form of a surplus. Okay, so it's in good shape. It's in good shape now for dismantling, not for retrieving, not for repairing. We don't repair anything. We don't remedy anything. We just throw more money at it, put more patches on it, and we make a paper monster. Okay, now, the Saudi event, the break, we got a good indication of it, I think it was about 8 months ago, when they arrested a bunch of Saudi royals and a bunch of Saudi businessmen and hung them by their feet, beat them, and tried to shake them down. It's kind of a good image. You hang by the feet and you try to shake the coins out of the pockets. Okay, that's basically what they did. And there was talk, again, it was bullshit, nonsense, basically with the pockets. Okay, that's basically what they did. And there was talk, again, it was bullshit nonsense, that the Saudis were going to recover $600 billion, and rumors floated, well, they need something to cover their Yemen war. That's another point later. But they also needed to cover the lower revenues for a lower oil price. Okay, so the Saudis are hurting from a lower oil price. Whew. The lower oil price has hurt a number of nations, like the OPEC nations. And they don't just produce oil, they produce iron and aluminum and copper. They're all hurting, including like Peru, which is not an oil producer. They produce a tremendous amount of copper, and a very high percentage for their foreign revenues of copper. Okay, so this Saudi break resulted, in my opinion, with the United States concluding it's time to get rid of them. And the phrase we often hear is throw them under the bus. And I heard from 2 years ago and 3 years ago that the U.S. has been stealing the Arab gold in the Swiss bullion banks. Mm-hmm. Now the big story, and Trump let this out, and I don't know why he would do this, but Trump said the $3 trillion that the Saudis own in treasury bonds probably will not be returned. That's as close to the quote that I can come up with. In other words, the Saudis are no longer useful. They served as the main conduit for the formation of the petrodollar, the dollar backed by oil. That's basically what it is, de facto. Right. In practical words and practical events and function, the dollar was backed by oil. And the Treasury bond was backed by oil purchases, right. Was funded by oil purchases. Okay, that is all coming apart. And the United States decided to steal the Arab gold and to steal their $3 trillion core to the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is another point later. Okay. That's this point. Sorry, looking at my notes. The Exchange Stabilization Fund might soon get a little bit more publicity, and they want no publicity for it because it is a main control center for numerous very large trillion-dollar markets, financial markets. I'm referring to the Forex market of currencies. I'm referring to the Treasury bond market of bonds. I'm referring to the LIBOR market for credit. And you can add on and on and on for the controlled markets by the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Finally, they needed to steal $3 trillion from the Saudis to keep the core and keep it solid. I'm hearing it might have as much as $10 trillion in it, and 3 of it was just taken from the Saudis. Wow. Okay, fine. Number 5 point. I need a sip of water.
Go right ahead. It's been quite a list so far, and I'm sure everybody listening is getting a lot out of this, Jim. Like I said, every year, I mean, these are things, I suppose, people have heard kind of around the periphery, have heard, oh yeah, I forgot about that, or I hadn't thought about that. And as you rattle these off, it certainly sets us up again for a discussion about, okay, so what's coming next? But please keep going. I know we're on point number 5.
Big icon Western banks are falling. It's not just Western icon banks. It's Western icon financial giants and industrial, I don't know what to call them, powerhouses, stalwarts. I remember when I was reading about, stock strategy, there was always a chapter about the stalwart companies. I mean, like, the big car makers, the big electronic companies, the big network computer companies, the big PC companies, whatever the class, the leader in the field, they're called the stalwart. Okay. It started with Deutsche Bank. I don't want to get into a long discussion of Deutsche Bank, but I will say this. They were forced to take over Bankers Trust by Wall Street so that the entire derivative shop in 1998 could be moved offshore outside the regulatory eyes and be managed in Germany, which operated as the primary narco-trafficking funding, narco-trafficking bank for doing money laundering.
Yeah.
And it's also now being nicknamed the Schurf Bank, which is Papa Bush's born name in Nazi Germany. I don't want to get into that whole story. Okay, so the big icon Western firms, including the banks, are in trouble. It went from Deutsche Bank, which, by the way, went from 130, including the banks, are in trouble. It went from Deutsche Bank, which, by the way, went from $130, $150 stock to under 10. Okay, this is exactly what happened to Fannie Mae stock.
Yeah.
In 2005 and 6 and 7, which made me conclude at the end of 2007, Fannie Mae is going to have a failure. We're going to have a mortgage bond problem, and Fannie Mae will be at the epicenter of this. And the unspoken element of that story, Craig, is that China triggered the whole subprime bond crisis by dumping Fannie Mae bonds, and all they said was, we're going to focus on treasuries. They did not say, we're going to dump Fannie Mae.
Right.
The second domino that I think fell, in my interpretation, is that General Electric got downgraded to B grade, triple B.
That's one of those stalwarts. That was all I was going to add.
Yes. And there are many more like GE. Okay, I've got some smart guys in my colleague, my Jackass colleague group, and two of them said to me, Jim, get ready for $1 trillion of debt downgrade from U.S. corporate funds.
Whoa. And
most of them are going to end up as junk. Now, he didn't say that we're going to get $1 trillion of downgrades going to junk. He said we're going to get $1 trillion of downgrades like what we saw for GE. And they're going to move eventually to junk, which means pension funds and mutual funds cannot hold them. They're not investment grade if they get moved to junk, which I think is the second highest triple B rating. The highest triple B is like a warning. You're triple B now, and anything that happens, and you can junk, which I think is the second highest triple B rating. The highest triple B is like a warning. You're triple B now, and anything that happens, and you cannot be held by these funds.
Right.
So if they ever get down, if GE gets downgraded again, and I think they will. And why? Because they abused the corporate bonds. They used corporate bonds to buy their own stock. They did not invest in their company, and that is a cancerous thing to do. I'd like to make a point about GE. Some people might say, but Jim, GE's not a bank. I beg to differ with you.
Yeah.
GE has a very big financial arm, and I don't know the exact figures, but I'm guessing more than 10% of their business is financial, and it could be like 20% or more.
Yeah.
I don't have it in front of me.
GE Capital or whatever.
GE Financial.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. GE Capital. Okay, so why is this happening to U.S. corporate bonds? Well, you could get into a long diatribe about how that happened, but if you're a fund manager or you're managing like an investment bank operation, and you see that the Fed is going in there buying treasuries, you're going to start dumping your treasuries and letting them have all they want. And you're going to start speculating in other things. So instead of moving into a safe, secure AAA, legitimate AAA treasury, you're going to start dabbling in a lot of crappy investments. And then something happened in Europe. The European Central Bank announced about 2 years ago they're going to buy corporate bonds. And why? Because no one wants.
Exactly.
In other words, the European Central Bank, their version of the Fed, they're going to wreck the corporate bond market so that anybody who's running a pension fund, mutual fund, investment bank.
Exactly.
In other words, the European Central Bank, their version of the Fed, they're going to wreck the corporate bond market so that anybody who's running a pension fund, mutual fund, investment bank operation, they're going to say, I've got some crappy bonds here. I'm going to sell it to the Euro Central Bank, and I'm going to take this money, and I'm going to go out and speculate and do it all over again for the next class, which is the high yield and the emerging market. And they're in trouble too. So the big icon Western banks and financial stalwart firms are in trouble and look for a massive sequence of downgrades and eventually some orders from the U.S. Fed and Wall Street and the U.S. government together to stop the downgrades.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? When you hear that, you'll know the crisis is well along.
Yep. It's not only GE or GM. right? Deutsche Bank, as you said, is all-time lows and getting worse. Big part of the...
It's Commerce Bank. Commerce Bank in Germany. Commerce Bank with the Z.
Yeah.
Their stock is down 85%.
And they're going to merge those
Italian
two.
banks.
And they're going to merge Commerce Bank. And give me a break. All right, on to number 6.
That'll make it all healthy, right? I mean, let me get that right. If they merge two dead entities, they're all healthy, right?
Exactly. That's the idea.
Yeah. Right. All
right, number 6.
Okay, next point. A gigantic new consortium has started, and it's the it's the Belt and Road initiative led by China. There's something like 200 nations that are involved in this now. I don't have a full starting to gather an impression for is what nations are not in it. And it's a small, short list that includes the United States. Now, for the longest time, no U.S. corporations were involved in this Belt and Road initiative. And now I've come to learn in the last several months, something changed in about May or June. There are 2 or 3 large U.S. companies that wanted a piece of this. What did they exactly want a piece of? Yeah. How about a $6 trillion cornucopia of hundreds of large-scale projects? Okay, well, what's the common denominator of this table of projects? Well, there are a few common denominators. One is that China is basically making decisions on what projects are worthy. And also, they're not going to be paid in dollars. I mean, when the project is done, let's say it's a bridge, and it's going to connect 2 economies. The 2 economies are going to engage in trade, and they're not going to use the dollar. Okay, so non-dollar function is a main characteristic of the Belt and Road, and that's one reason the United States doesn't want to have part of it, which means the United States is going to be isolated when it grows to become the majority of nations in the community of nations of this globe. This is big.
Yeah,
it's $6 trillion and growing. Every time you turn your head, there's a new project like a bridge in Thailand or a giant port in Sri Lanka or something. What exactly is this Belt and Road? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's the answer to George Orwell's Oceania, the British maritime monopoly that connects the United States. The British maritime monopoly that connects the United States, connected Australia, connected Hong Kong, and connected other various parts of the world for a century. This is coming not to an end. It's coming to a point where it's going to be eclipsed by the Chinese system of ports and the Chinese system of railroads and the Chinese system of pipelines and the Chinese system of bridges that are going to connect Eurasia and form what I've been calling the Eurasian Trade Zone. I don't like it being called the Eurasian Economic Union because we've already got 2 other EUs.
Yeah.
The first EU is the United States, which is États-Unis in French, and it's Estados Unidos in Spanish. And we got the European Union, which is now what? It's called the EEW. I don't want a triple E, triple U. Let's call it the Eurasian Trade Zone, ETZ. Okay, there are going to be loads and loads of free trade zones like Shanghai, which is serving as a model. Okay, so the Belt and Road Initiative is a non-dollar global strike against the United States. It's going to be trade payment, not in dollars.
Right.
It's going to be initially trade payments in RMB, and eventually it'll go to trade payments in gold trade note, which is coming up. Okay.
Number 7?
Next point. Yeah. There's no great order, but I'm trying to do my best.
No, you're doing great. Keep going.
Okay. Number 7. I call it the Rosneft oil cartel. Okay. OPEC is dead.
Yeah.
OPEC, it's really not functioning.
Yeah.
They meet, but they don't do anything. They come up with an agreement, and it's funny.
Yeah,
it used to be for years that the lesser OPEC nations would make an accord, and the Saudis would say no. Now you have the Saudis making an accord with Russia, and the rest are saying no. It's funny. It's funny. They're dead. OPEC is dead. They don't do anything. They don't decide on anything. Their output requirements and quotas, they're not being honored. It's a big nothing organization. Well, what has filled the void? And what are its characteristics? Well, you've got the Russians coming in, and they buy Venezuelan oil. The Russians come in, and they buy Iranian oil. The Russians come in, and they buy Mexican oil. The Russians come in, and they buy Saudi oil. They're buying oil from the major producers. Not because the Russians need to buy oil. It's because the Russians are forming an oil cartel. This is not in the New York Times, one of the biggest toilet paper rags in modern history. This is not in the New York Times, one of the biggest toilet paper rags in modern history. This is not in the Wall Street Journal, which is basically a Wall Street, propaganda rag. The Russians are forming a cartel with Venezuela, Iran, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, in order to manage the oil output and quality. So what does Rosneft actually do? Well, for instance, they help out Venezuela. Venezuela in the Orinoco region has extremely heavy crude. Right. It's not just heavy, it's loaded with sulfur contaminants. The Russians are going to serve two functions, a leading role in cleaning the contaminant level and mixing the viscosity to make it sellable on the market. I don't care whether it's the Ural, the Ural contract for Russia. I don't care if it's the St. Pete contract for Russia. I'd be oil standard to compete with the dollar and make a nice transition to the gold trade note. Okay, the Rosneft oil cartel is very significant. Look to see who they team up with next.
Yeah.
I guarantee you they're going to work to team up with Nigeria and Angola and other major non-Arab OPEC nations. Whew.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. That's certainly not something that's on everybody's radar. That's very and how it ties
very important.
How it ties into the yuan-denominated crude oil contract and that general move away from dollar pricing in crude oil and the impact that has on the petrodollar and thus the dollar demand and that just trickles all the way through. So that was a very good one. You got any more on your list?
Yeah, number 8, price inflation. Now
that was a very good one. You got any more on your list?
Yeah, number 8, price inflation. Now there was a guy named Chapwood, and 3 years ago he came up with a Chapwood CPI, Consumer Price Index. And what Chapwood did was he took 50 U.S. cities and 500 items for a basket of things to buy, whose prices are to be monitored. Okay, Chapwood came up with a CPI index that I think stretched from about 2002 to about 2014. It was a good 10 or 12 year period. And what Chapwood concluded was the U.S. has 8% price inflation. He included some services, like water bills,
Sure.
Just the bill to clean your septic tank, just various services and items in a basket. He concluded that we have items in a basket. He concluded that we have 8 to 10% price inflation, and the overestimate. I'm sorry, I didn't say that right. The suppressed CPI of the managed 2 to 3% by Reich economics law, the 2 or 3% had an overall cumulative effect of making the U.S. economy 22% smaller than the beginning of his sample.
Yeah.
What he actually was saying in conclusion was, by doctoring the CPI and claiming that we've got X, Y, and Z for economic growth, GDP growth, whatever, the reality is that we were 22% lower after the 12 years were factored in with a correct, accurate CPI to deflate to deflate what they call the nominal GDP. If you just take total sum last year, give me the number. Those are called the nominal figures, which they alter and adjust by means of a consumer price index, and they get their own favorite deflator index, which is even more suppressed. Yeah. It's all bullshit.
With a capital B.
So we've got price inflation, Craig. We've got it, and we've had it for quite a while. And here are 3 reasons why I think we have price inflation. Now, I think it was some of the masters, whether it was Samuelson or Greenspan. Who was the rival of Samuelson? I can't think of his name. There were 2 main guys. Friedman, Samuelson, and Greenspan all reiterated the same point. The principal basis of all inflation is the excess creation of money. Point. The principal basis of all inflation is the excess creation of money and credit.
Yep.
So you make more money to cover the debts, or you create more debt, like in big companies and households, and the extra money that floats around chases a certain amount of finite goods and services to produce an increase in price. Okay, that is the nature of inflation. Okay, the monetary increase is one item, one factor for inflation. A second one, this is not so much in the textbooks. This is my impression. The second one is harmed supply. When you've got functions like quantitative easing from the central bank, and they go out and chase unproductive assets, and they force misallocation of capital, and it doesn't chase the most efficient machine, it chases the most desired machine, the most politically correct machine. The result is that you interfere with the efficiency of supply formation. And with reduced supply, let's just make up an example. These clowns in Washington and Wall Street decide we don't like marbles. We don't like marbles because they interfere with our laser machines, and we just don't like natural marbles. We're not going to do any quartz mining and production of nice, beautiful, spherical marbles. We don't want them anymore. Okay, if they kind of legislate marbles out of the way, you're going to see the price go up for real marbles. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can alter the supply by making certain things politically correct. I think. Yeah. Okay, there's a third factor involved in price inflation, and this is more recent, a big factor. Trump has, I think, done something very stupid. He's done a lot of very good things, and he's doing some great cleanup of the swamp and some of the really nasty elite criminals who are involved in narco trafficking, child trafficking, racketeering for political bribery, you name it. He's rounding a lot of them up, and I'm very curious to see how that turns out. But he's done something that's quite stupid, and this is the trade war with China. Now, he might have an ulterior motive to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, but what he's ending up doing is creating price inflation for all the squeezed supply. And there was a story that came out, it was around July or so, I remember it vividly. It was an Ohio-based nail manufacturing company. I'm talking about construction nail. Yep. You hammer it together and you get a house as a result. Okay, so the nail company was having some supply problems, and they had to lay off half their workforce because of an increase in the prices of all their cost structure coming from China. Now, there's a big downside for the outsourcing of U.S. industry since the mid-1980s, and that is you reduce your supply, your domestic manufacturing from industry. And the result is that you also have more of a reliance on foreign suppliers. You engage in a trade war with some of them, and your prices go up. So whether it's increased money supply, ruined supply systematically ruining supply, the sector, or whether it's trade war, the U.S. has more price inflation. This is a very big phenomenon. It's going to undermine the Treasury bonds and make it very hard to produce sectum, systematically ruining supply, the sector, or whether it's trade war, the U.S. has more price inflation. This is a very big phenomenon. It's going to undermine the Treasury bonds and make it very hard to produce a Treasury rally when they come out with absolutely nonsensical CPI reports that get dismissed in the following days. Some of the dismissals that I've read in the last few months were, oh my gosh, you've got a flat new car component for the CPI? Well, golly, why don't you take a look at 2 or 3 of the different manufacturers? They're up 8% in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're getting dismissed and challenged for their CPI nonsense. Whew.
I'm looking at the clock, Jim, and since we're both kind of up against a hard limit of another 15 or 20 minutes, I'm wondering, do you have any more that you want to hit briefly, or should we go straight into here as we flip the calendar to 2019? Here's what we should be watching.
I won't go to my 10th, but I will hit the 9th. It's the outing, the exposure of the globalist banker cabal, the Khazarian mafia. I call them the globalist fascists, the globalists, the banker cabal. It's the owners of the central banks plus Basel, their hive, their center. They're getting outed. And for the last many, many years, don't even want to delineate it. It could be the last 30 or 40 years, but it could also be the last 100 years. They've been involved in a lot of very nasty, serious, heinous crimes against humanity. And we're not just talking about, produce little of cancer before then. Let me say that again. The entire vaccination, I got about 5 or 6, measles, mumps, smallpox, polio. I had about 5 or 6, and I'm done, and I'm strong as a horse. I don't get sick. I had that thing back in May of 2017, bronchitis, and man, that knocked me on my ass.
Yeah, I remember.
But I haven't been sick since. Craig. A little cold last 2 days, big deal. I don't count that. I haven't had a serious virus since. Okay, I had 5 or 6 vaccines. Take a look at the vaccine regimen now for little kids. I know some little kids, little babies that I'm helping along right now. I'm telling the mothers, do not take vaccines more than the basic 4 or 5. Now we got an exposure in Italy. A big analysis company is taking a look at some of the common multi-virus vaccines, and they're finding there's nothing in them except contaminants and poison and shit.
Yeah, preservatives.
Okay, that's Italy. Preservatives, adjutants, contaminants, and I think agents to suppress the human immune system. This is going to be a very big issue of outing Big Pharma. And just take a look at the case with Monsanto and their herbicide, glyphosate. They lost their case. And now comes the class action suits. They build upon each other. You cannot have a big case that's negative that gets supported in the appellate system without having it become the basis of a class action with 200 more right behind it. And that's what's happening with Monsanto, which got bought out by Bayer in Germany. I don't understand that at all. I think Trump and a few others actually told them, look, you're dead meat. You better find a buyer because it's coming, pal. It's coming.
Sounds a lot like Bankers Trust and Deutsche Bank, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what other large crimes the cabal involved in? It's child trafficking for Satanist murders. Okay. I don't want to get into this much. It's also women trafficking and human organ trafficking. There was a movie that I saw. It was about 8 years ago. It starred Rachel Weisz, who's a fine actress. Rachel Weisz, Weisz. She was in The Mummy, the two with Brandon Fraser, The Mummy. She was the woman star player. She was in a movie about 8 years ago that exposed the United Nations as being involved in white woman trafficking from Eastern Europe. This is not new. This is long-standing. and the elite are all over this. They're also involved. The principal players for human organ trafficking are the United States and Israel. And if you're looking for where they end up, they're in the Israeli hospitals and in New Jersey hospitals. Okay, they're getting outed, and the Clinton Foundation is like the center of all elite global political nefarious, traitorous activity, racketeering. You know, pay for play. Pay for play is a nice way of, gosh, it makes it sound like I have to play it to go on the go-kart route.
Right.
Around in loop. No, you pay to play in treason, so you get a list of agents that you can murder. Okay. Hillary Clinton apparently is not going to be getting any kind of deals. This is all coming out.
Yeah.
Okay. It's all coming out. I shouldn't say all. It's beginning to come out, and we're going to see how much comes to the other side. All right, that's the end of my list.
All right.
I was going to talk about global trade war, but and we touched a little bit on global trade war. That's okay.
Well, all right. So, Jim, like I said, I know we both kind of have a limit to our time this morning, unfortunately. So, as we flip the calendar, I mean, we began this by addressing, you know, I think 2019 is going to be some kind of wild year. We got the political events, political risk here in the U.S. A change of Fed policy obviously is coming. All of this military stuff, U.S. military in retreat you're talking about. Gold is already anticipating that. Silver finally starting to break up as well. I don't know. Let's just put it this way, Jim. I mean, obviously you and I are going to talk again, and we do these throughout the year. What events do you see happening, or what should stuff that people should be paying attention to, let's say, through the first quarter and into the springtime?
I point to four things. And I know I'm a guy who seems like he always has a list. I don't. Right. I formulate lists on the fly.
Yeah, hit those four. That'd be
according to what I consider important events to watch for the future. And I have a feeling that they're all going to work in favor toward gold. Okay. I'll end up with gold as the last, and I'll go in a certain order. Look for severe problems in the U.S. Treasury bond. It's a subprime bond, and like Fannie Mae suffered and the mortgage bond suffered in 2008, we're going to see the U.S. Treasury bond suffer now. It's going to suffer in the form of unpayable $22 trillion in debt. It's going to suffer from no buyers and exposure of the actual demand that comes from machinery owned by the U.S. Department of Treasury. So they're self-dealing. Okay, the word for that is monetization. The country is monetizing its own debt, and they're doing it in a hidden fashion. The country is monetizing its own debt, and they're doing it in a hidden fashion that's going to be coming out, while the globe is dumping treasuries and removing the dollar from trade payment. So look for a problem in the treasury bond. Second, look for a problem in the big Western banks. I refer to Western Europe, the United States, and the UK, London. We're seeing it with Deutsche Bank. Now you're seeing a very big event taking place right now in the breakdown of the BKX U.S. Big Bank Stock Index. Yeah. BKX. Never seen anything like it in all my years. It's down like 30%, 25-30% in 2.5 months. I've never seen anything like it before. It resembles the early decay and decline of Fannie Mae stock. So we could be seeing and decline of Fannie Mae stock. So we could be seeing a crisis of large proportions with the Wall Street banks, and you got to ask, well, what is their problem? Well, I'll tell you a couple of their problems. One is the end of the bond carry trade. They were borrowing at 0% and investing in the 2.5% Treasury bond, and that took it down to 1.6. Now with Fed tightening, they're having to get out of that, unwind it. So you're seeing what they call a convexity effect of amplified Treasury sales. they could get into an uncontrollable unwind here of their bond carry trade at Wall Street. It's not just Wall Street. It's the big Western banks. They don't have a business of lending commercially. They don't have a business of bond issuance. They have a business of derivatives and bond, and it's of bond issuance. They have a business of derivatives and bond carry trade, and it's getting smothered.
Yeah.
Okay. When Italy goes down or when Deutsche Bank goes down, it'll take down Italy, which will take down the French banks because the French banks have 4 times as much Italian exposure as the German banks do to Italy. Okay. That kind of crisis, I should have concluded on point number A. The U.S. Treasury bond problems are going to feed the gold market, feed the bull market in gold. The bank problems are not going to result in a flight into Treasury bonds. It's going to result into a flight for gold. The third point, the banker cabal. They're being scattered. They're being decimated. I got told by The Voice in 2016, and are going to be eradicated. And I said, please explain. And he said, well, think of them as the captains for getting things done. A general in his castle, sipping brandy with an ascot, with his lovely dog at his feet, will not do anything to get his hands dirty. He will call his captains to get it done, whether it's chemtrails, or whether it's fracking, or whether it's GMO foods, or whether it's laced vaccines. You get the idea. The captains are being eradicated for 3 years. And I said, please describe their type. And he said, well, think of one as being eradicated by just being convinced to turn evidence to Interpol and cooperate. And let's just think of a certain player has $20 billion, a big player, secrecy, $20 billion. He's told, cooperate, you can keep 12. Hand over 8, you keep 12, maybe 14. If you provide us some really juicy information on the Rothschilds. So they flip. Okay, that's one form. The second is they end up just not being salvageable, and they get killed.
Yeah.
Another form, and who does the killing? Lots and lots of questions having to do with this, and I asked some, and I didn't get many answers, but when I did get answers, I heard that the White Dragons were involved in a lot of this eradication process, and they hired the triad, mafia, of Hong Kong to murder a few dozen middle-level cabal players in Western Europe and London. Okay, or they got killed, and what's the other one? Well, they weren't salvageable, and they decided, well, we're not going to kill these guys. We don't want to kill them all. Let's just... Or they got killed, and what's the other one? Well, they weren't salvageable, and they decided, well, we're not going to kill these guys. We don't want to kill them all. Let's just seize their assets. And this is part of what Trump is doing. So they got stripped. They flipped, they stripped, or they were killed. Okay, this is a very big factor in the West right now. The White Dragons are like the Chinese representatives for cleaning up the globe, both financially and economically. And while they're at it, make a good effort to clean up the integrity of the globe, like the North Pacific, which is contaminated with, we could have like 1,000 feet of marine dead garbage, not, like Coke cap bottles, dead mammals, dead fish piling up in the North Pacific. Okay, this needs a remedy. This is part of the contaminant wrecking the planet. Okay, now, when you have the cabal weakened, you're going to have a lot of attention given to legitimate sound money like gold. Their whole project is to maintain an unsound monetary system so that they can do what Ron Paul and his independent audit revealed in 2009. After Lehman, they gave themselves, the owners of the Fed, they gave themselves $23 trillion in 0% loans. Yeah. They don't want the gold standard. They want a phony standard so they can give themselves money. Okay, this is going to work toward gold. Next point. U.S. military is in retreat, being recognized as not the world power, not the supreme primary power, not at all. I don't want to get into who is. I just want to tell you that I gave you some examples, figure it out. There's another force out there that is working with the Russians. I don't want to get into who is. I just want to tell you that I gave you some examples, figure it out. There's another force out there that is working with the Russians. The U.S. military does not have the best weapons. They don't have the best fighter aircraft. They don't have the best anti-missile system. They don't have the best missile or missile defense system. I don't think they even have the best aircraft carrier type. Our aircraft carriers look the same as what they did 50 years ago. We don't have advances. What we have is tremendous cost overruns and huge budgets for the military corporations. Okay, the military retreat is going to eliminate something that I made as a forecast back in 2005. I said eventually, when I started this newsletter, the Hat-Trick Letter, I said eventually you're going to have the dollar defended by the military to block the Gazprom pipelines. You're seeing it in Syria to block the Iranian gas pipeline. Now you're seeing a retreat in something that's going to get a lot of exposure in the next several months. The U.S. has basically dropped its proxy support of the Saudis and UAE, which are using Australian mercenaries, by the way, in the Yemen war, which I don't like calling it the Yemen war. I call it the filthy Yemen war. Yeah. The Saudis are trying to replace their depleted oil reserves by stealing Yemens to their south and doing lateral. I got this confirmed by an oil engineer 2 months ago. He said, Jim, when you said there's lateral drilling from Saudi into Yemeni deposits, you're exactly right. It's happening on multiple locations. Okay, the Yemen war is going to get UN attention and worse. Okay, when the U.S. military retreats, I think we're going to see support from the forcible honoring of the dollar system. It's going to enable a faster de-dollarization. The last point is the conclusion of all this. We're working toward the gold standard. It's going to be extremely difficult to implement. It's going to take a long time to implement because something extraordinary has happened for the last 30 years. And that's the U.S. government, military, and Langley's support of narcotics production, distribution, and trafficking. All their profits, all their investments are in dollars. Yeah. Now, I asked The Voice one time, this is about 6 or 8 years ago, what happened when, he's European. I said, what happened, and he knows a good deal about Germany and Switzerland. And the whole centers like Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, the money centers. He knows a lot about them. I asked him, what's going to happen to the U.S. military complex? Will it happen in parallel like what happened in Nazi Germany? What did happen with the military complex where they had superior tanks, superior machine guns, superior aircraft, superior missiles? What happened to all that technology? And he said 2 things, Jim. Some of it went to the U.S. because Operation Paperclip opened the door. But a very big project took place, and it was called the Odessa Group, like the name of the Russian city in their east. The Odessa Group came to be a big arms merchant, a big black market arms merchant. Okay, well, if that happens to the U.S. military complex, I don't think it's all going to be converted into a very good, peaceful usage. I think there's going to be a splintering. There'll be a core that remains in the United States and does, good projects like building. All going to be converted into a very good, peaceful usage. I think there's going to be a splintering. There'll be a core that remains in the United States and does, good projects like building bridges, for Lord's sake. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they know how to build a bridge. They can build them fast and build them well. They can also build the ones that aren't temporary, like to cross a river for battle zones. Okay, so you're going to see the implementation of the gold standard. It'll start out with the gold trade note. I think it'll be used by China and and Gulf region. I say Gulf, not Arab. The Gulf region, because that'll be the Arabs and Iran. The Gulf region will use the gold trade note, which might require, say, 5, 8, 10% gold put up as equity in order to finance a shipment of oil or a shipment of gas or a shipment of LNG. China will start this, and then you're going to start to see the second round of the gold standard, which will be the. I think we're going to see Chinese government bonds push out treasuries. I think they're going to go straight from treasuries to gold trade notes and gold long-term bonds and gold bullion. Then the third step for the gold standard will be the institution, creation, funding, and launching of currencies that are backed by gold.
Yeah.
And it's not a necessary step. It's really not. You can use the gold trade note, Craig, to handle a lot of trade payments and a lot of cross-border, like, India working a deal. I love this example given by Euroraj. He said, a big IT deal for 10 years, it cost $2 billion between India and Saudi Arabia, or India and UAE, or India and Qatar. Okay, how do you pay for that? Well, they could use gold trade notes. But, a gold trade note is really to satisfy short-term, not long-term obligations. Is really to satisfy short-term, not long-term obligations and investments and core asset stabilization. So I think the U.S. Treasury bond troubles, the big bank troubles, the cabal exposure, and U.S. military retreat are all going to work in 2019 toward the gold standard and acceptance of gold. And I'm looking, I don't have a timetable. I'm looking for it to take out the 1900 figure. First thing it's got to take out is 1350. And then we're going to be looking at 1900. And then it's going to be, I think, a matter of, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel ordering major central banks to load up on gold to cover their defaulting treasury bonds.
Yeah.
They're all loaded up on treasury bonds, and they're all toxic. And they're all going to fall.
Well, my friend,
Well,
you have
that's
done.
it.
I got to tell you, you've done a wonderful, your usual masterful job of informing us. Your usual masterful job of informing us about stuff you've seen, letting us know where you think things are headed. And if this is your first time listening to the Jackass, please understand. I mean, he's been at this for a long time and has been way out ahead of the curve in understanding where all this is headed and how all the pieces connect. Again, you can find the Hat Trick Letter at goldenjackass.com. That's where you find all of the information from the great Jim Willie. Jim, just great stuff. And on behalf of everybody here, we appreciate you walking us through all of it. And I'm sure, it's going to be an interesting start to the year. And once we get back together, sometime maybe at the end of the first quarter, I'll be curious to see where we are. But for now, I know you got to run, so thank you for your time. Thank you for all this information, and all the best in the new year, my friend.
Well, thanks a lot, and I appreciate being on, and I hope people go to the goldenjackass.com, but also golden hyphen. And, I've got a new venture, too. I just want to speak about it for
Sure.
less than a minute. It's with V Gorilla and London Paul and Ken Shortchen and me. We got a new site. It's called The Gadfly. And I hope people go to it. It's a new venture. It's only been going now for a month and a half to 2 months, and it's actually to compete against some of the more popular YouTube and things like that are having troubles and defections for censorship and a lot of different things. I don't want to get into a criticism of YouTube because they've done well by me, but they've not done well recently with the censorship and seizing
Right.
of ad revenue and things like that. It's a very, very common complaint. But the Gadfly addresses that, and we're excited. We've got a few hundred already in the first month, and we're hoping that this is bigger and brighter days ahead. And that's where many of my interviews, I do some public interviews, I'm trying not to bigger and brighter days ahead, and that's where many of my interviews, I do some public interviews, I'm trying not to do the YT interviews, and you know what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
So we got the Gadfly to compete against some of the bigger censorship houses. So I hope people go to the Hat Trick Letter because this year is going to be exciting, and I think a lot of things were set up in the last several months that are going to bear fruit in the next several months.
No doubt about it. Again, yeah, goldenjackass.com, golden-jackass.com. And again, check out those podcasts at Gadfly. It's gadfly.tv or something, isn't it, if I remember right? It's the actual web address, Jim. Something like that. Well, I bet if you just...
it's HTTPS colon /thegadfly.vhx.tv.
There you
like
go.
Very high X-ray. VHX.TV. It's a broadcast site with huge bandwidth, and we have to create the strong foundation here.
Yeah.
Because it's not written. It's all audio and video. So it's all broadcast. And I've already done 5 or 6 segments, like on the vaccines, on what is fascism, California fires, election result interpretation, stuff like that. So fringe stories and the cutting edge.
Right.
Thanks for having me on, and it's been fun. It's always fun.
It is always
fun
fun
with you.
And it's going to be a very fun 2019. So thank you, Jim. And